Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I thank you, IISD, for the invitation to come and speak on an issue which I have personally been very, very interested, and that is the issue of what to do about implementing climate change legislation on a country-specific basis, which is where we have so far seem to be going. Well, I'll get back to that in a moment. So I thought I would start with a little bit of historical perspective. In 2009, there was a considerable debate in the United States over the adoption of climate change regulation. It was based on a cap-and-trade system. It evolved into a very heated debate over the allocation of allowances. By and large, the issue of leakage was not a part of the debate until midway through, when people began raising the question, well, what will happen if we as a country adopt climate change legislation based on cap and trade, and we don't apply it to imports, if we don't make border adjustments? One proposal was put forward by the American electric car industry, which would have gradually implemented a system of applying international reserve allowances, which would have required allowances for imports after an extensive period of negotiation, examination of alternative systems of control in other countries and so forth. All designed to deal with the problem of leakage, which Lutz has carefully and I think very well described. Another proposal was advanced by the basic industries we've heard talked about here today: steel, cement, aluminum, paper, and certain chemicals. These industries were concerned that the pending legislation, even if modified by the proposal from the electric car industry, would nevertheless result in extensive leakage issues for the domestic industry. So they came up with an alternative proposal. I have to admit I was involved to some extent in this, so there's a certain personal interest here. But the proposal would have provided that carbon emissions per unit of production would be set by regulation for basic industries within the United States. Products with a carbon intensity, however complex the measurement process, would be excluded from the market. And this would be applicable to both domestic and imported products. Thus, imports from countries with lower standards for production, for carbon regulation, would not be able to export to the United States, and that would eliminate the competitive advantage they would have in the U.S. market if the border adjustment was not made. Another thought was that by imposing these carbon intensity standards domestically, U.S. countries would be discouraged from offshoring to countries with a low or non-existent regulatory scheme. Such countries could then re-export to the United States if there was no border adjustment provision. Of course, that was not an ideal solution. Offshoring would still occur, where U.S. companies would go to places where there was low regulatory levels for production for sale in those markets. There was a select issue, which means that countries could select their best, cleanest production for sale in the United States and sell their other production with lower emission intensity locally. Now, Congress did not adopt that or any of those legislative proposals. However, since then, the concept of carbon intensity standards has been adopted in one state in the United States, that is California, which is a low carbon fuel standard, which requires that the that the blender of fuel for sale within California must meet a certain baseline for their entire fuel pool. And this applies to both fuel blended in California and fuel from outside. And this is a mandatory standard, and it can be met both by blending fuel that meets the standard and also by buying credits from companies that have exceeded the standard and have excess supply. Now, note there's a fundamental difference between the California rule and what was proposed by the basic industries. The California rule applies to the emission of carbon after sale by the producer, whereas the basic industry proposal would apply to the carbon greenhouse gases emitted during production. So there is a fundamental difference. Now, turning to the WTO, would that or either of those proposals pass muster? One approach would be to try and obtain an exemption under Article 20 of the GATT, given that there would be a restriction on imports that would be covered by Article 11. An alternative would be to consider the technical barriers to trade agreement. The TBT regulates products, regulates and produces special rules for what I call technical regulations. And a technical regulation is a document that lays down product characteristics or their related processes and production methods with which compliance is mandatory. Now, mandatory is a key word here because that allows you to apply standards at the border. Now, under the conclusions of a number of appellate body decisions, characteristics which are likely to be standard, which are technical regulations, do not need to be an intrinsic element of the product. They can relate to labeling, they can relate to a variety of other ways of characterizing a product. So there has been a broad definition of what is a product characteristic that can be a technical regulation. Now, the preamble to the TBT, and I think this is an important factor, emphasizes that it is designed to allow countries to enact measures to protect the environment at levels it considers appropriate, as long as the other requirements of the TBT are met. Technical regulations must be legitimate in their objective, and here again I would recall that there is a very strong emphasis in the TBT agreement concerning protection of the environment. Technical regulations must not be designed to be a restriction on trade. And finally, technical regulations have to be no more restrictive than necessary to meet the legitimate objective for which they were designed. There's a very special and unique provision requiring special and differential treatment for the application of technical regulations to developing countries. The TBT in Article 12 requires a country in developing a technical regulation to take into account the financial and trade needs of developing countries. And finally, where there are no detailed international standards which are in place, which is, I think, probably true with respect to the basic industry products that motivated this provision when it was submitted to the U.S. Congress, there are no international standards as to appropriate levels of carbon intensity, and we've heard today about the difficulties in measuring. But there is a procedure that is required to be followed to adopt standards under those circumstances. There are questions that are raised as to whether carbon intensity standards are mandatory, if they allow credits such as are provided under the California system. My answer to that is I believe that is all right if the program is looked at as a whole, which is the teaching of some appellate body decisions. A final question, which is very important, is whether if a standard is a technical regulation or is deemed a technical regulation, it meets all the other requirements of the TPD, Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement there, are the provisions of Article 3.11 of GATT 1994 preempted? In other words, does compliance with the TBT excuse one from compliance with Article 3 and Article 11 of the TBT? There is, I believe, ample is the wrong word. I believe there is authority in appellate body decisions from which one could conclude that the provision in the annex to the World Trade Organization agreement that provides that where there is a conflict between the provisions of an agreement like the TBT and the GATT 1994, the former shall take precedence. Now that's a complicated analysis, and I don't have time to go through it here. But in summary, I am of the view that properly implemented, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement is a potential route to dealing with the issue of leakage and the issue that individual countries may see the need to adopt unitary measures given the lack of any international agreement coming out of the UNFCCC negotiations. Thank you.